I think the biggest barrier we have in terms of human behavior is this lack of awareness and understanding that these issues are all connected and it's all going to affect us. Not just the poor people, not just the people who live on the other side of the world, but everybody. And so, it's like Al Gore said, it's an inconvenient truth, and most people just don't want to think about it and deal with it. But if we don't, then that cost is going to be even bigger than if we invest resources to do something about it today.
Mm-hmm.
And, one of the issues that I've been thinking about a lot is, we talk too much about metrics and numbers and quantifiable goals. Or maybe I shouldn't say we talk too much about it, but we overemphasize them, and we don't really talk about how we can actually engage people and have a conversation with people, not just at the policy level or at the business leader level, but on a, like you and me. Like,
Right.
how do we talk about it? How do you make it relevant to everyday people?
Mm.
And if we just talk about, we have to curb emissions by X% by this year, it doesn't mean anything, right? To
Right.
someone who lives in Texas. So how do we make it relevant to people? And also, and to do that, you have to connect the dots. So for example, when we talk about plastic pollution, most people only think about plastic that's floating in the ocean. So a lot of people know about the garbage patch and microplastics these days.
Right.
But we don't talk about how it affects poor communities where they live next to a fossil fuel plant, right? And I mean, I think a lot of people still don't understand that plastics are made from fossil fuels. So that's a huge problem. And then the cradle to grave journey that plastic takes. So after it's consumed, it goes to the landfill or recycling. Well, it's not really recycled much, but most of it goes to a landfill. Where are those landfills? Again, they're built in vulnerable communities. Or they're shipped overseas to poorer countries.
Right.
So it's literally this NIMBY idea of, well, I want to consume plastic, but I don't want to see it. So let's just ship it off to somewhere we can't see it. And so, like in the Philippines, for example, there are these very poor communities where they literally live on top of these landfills.
It's wild.
And we don't see it, right? And so we don't talk about plastic as a social issue, but we need to talk about it as a social issue. And this is why environmental and social aspects of sustainability come into interaction, is because these people, the poorer people, disproportionately always get affected by the environmental issues, and therefore it becomes a social issue. And it affects their health, it affects their mental development, it affects their stress levels, and it affects the entire trajectory of their lives.
And what's the best way to message to people about these social issues in a way that will make them care about issues that are presently sort of out of sight, out of mind? I heard you mention in one of the podcasts I listened to that the way you might message to liberal voters on a social issue will differ from the way you message to conservative voters. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. So as we know, this country is very polarized currently, and sadly, like climate change and sustainability have become a politically divisive issue, which is unfortunate because, interestingly, in the past and not so long ago, conservatives actually were environmentalists. Like they actually cared about the environment, and that's not crazy if you think about what they like to do. They like to go hunting, they like to go fishing, they like nature, they like the outdoors. So of course they should care about the environment. Also, going into religion, if the idea is to protect God's creation, which is how research shows that if it's framed that way, then conservatives say, yes, I care about the environment and I care about environmental issues, right? Versus how most liberals and people in the sustainability movement talk about environmental issues is not that way. They talk about fairness and care for victims and people who are oppressed. And that language just doesn't resonate across the aisle. So part of it is understanding what kind of language you should use to communicate if the ultimate objective is to change the other side's mind.
Right. Yeah.
And so I think oftentimes people get too caught up in like being right and being wrong, and then this being a zero sum game, which goes into the issues with analytic thinking because it leads to this myopic perspective on having this dichotomous notion that like if I'm right, then you're wrong. This is
Right.
the only way we should think about environmental issues is about
Mm,
fairness and care,
mm,
where it actually doesn't matter, right?
right.
The
Yeah.
outcome is what matters. So if you
Right.
want people to care, then let's think about how can we achieve that outcome.